cries tore through the thick stone. Walls of Pembroke Castle, desperate and ragged. On a narrow bed soaked with blood, a 13-year-old girl struggled for her life. Around her, the midwives whispered in fear. The child, because that's what she was, a child had been laboring for hours. Her small body straining to deliver a baby it was never meant to carry. The baby wouldn't come, and Margaret Beaufort was fading fast. In that moment, with frost blanketing the castle and death creeping closer, everyone in the room knew the unspeakable truth. Margaret Beaufort should never have been pregnant. This isn't the version of history you learned in school. For centuries, chroniclers softened the facts. But the real story, the one told in letters, court documents, and a priest's sermon decades later, is far more haunting. It's the story of how a young girl was swept into a political game she couldn't understand, and how that girl, shattered but unbroken, became the matriarch of England's most iconic royal house, the Tudors. Let's go back to the beginning. May 31st, 1443, Bletsoe Castle, Bedfordshire. A baby girl is born Margaret Beaufort. She comes into the world not as someone to be nurtured, but as a future heiress. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, is among the highest-ranking nobles in England. But within a year, he's gone dead under mysterious circumstances. The cause? Whispers say suicide. In 15th century England, that kind of death carried immense shame. Suddenly, Margaret's future is exposed. Her inheritance is enormous land, titles, prestige, and every ambitious man in the realm takes notice. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, tries to protect her. She keeps her close, teaches her languages, ensures her education. For a moment, it seems Margaret Beaufort might live a quiet life. But King Henry VI has other plans. When she's just 3 years old, Margaret is handed over to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. He marries her to his 7-year-old son, John, a 3-year-old bride. The marriage, though not consummated, is real, and it requires special permission from the Pope because of their kinship. That permission is granted without hesitation, but Suffolk's fortunes collapse. In 1453, he's murdered, and Margaret Beaufort, now 10, becomes available once more. That's when the king gives her to his half-brothers Edmund and Jasper Tudor. Edmund Tudor sees opportunity. The law at the time said that if an heiress died without children, her family regained her lands. But if she had a child, her husband kept her fortune for life. Margaret Beaufort wasn't seen as a person, she was a legal gateway to power. On November 1st, 1455, Edmund Tudor marries her. She is 12, he is 24. Even in an era where child marriages happened, there was an understood rule: wait to consummate until the girl is older, usually 14 or more. This wasn't out of kindness. It was about survival. They knew the risks. Young girls often didn't survive childbirth. But Edmund doesn't wait. Historians believe Margaret became pregnant shortly after the wedding. At 12 years old, her childhood ends. By the spring of 1456, Margaret is expecting. Imagine the fear. Morning sickness on a body that hadn't yet finished growing. Confusion, pain, isolation, and then tragedy. Edmund Tudor is captured during the Wars of the Roses. By November, he's dead either from illness or poor treatment in captivity. Margaret Beaufort is now 13, widowed, alone, and 7 months pregnant. She could have stayed in relative safety, but instead she travels across war-torn England to reach Pembroke Castle, where her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor waits. Despite her condition, despite the cold, despite the danger, she rides. And then, on January 28, 1457, her labor begins. The midwives would later say it was like nothing they'd ever seen. Margaret's body, small and slight, was not ready. Her hips hadn't matured. There was nowhere for the baby to go. The pain went on for hours. The damage done to her that night would last a lifetime, though she married again 3 more. Times Margaret Beaufort never bore another child. Think about that. In a time when noble women were expected to have many children, she had only 1. Her body, they said, never recovered. But that 1 child would change everything. She named him Henry, the boy who would become Henry VII. the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Years later, John Fisher, Margaret's priest and trusted advisor, gave a sermon describing that night. He said it was a miracle that a child could be born of so little a personage. The memory still shocked him, even half a century later. Modern doctors believe Margaret likely suffered serious injuries, physical trauma that permanently affected her ability to have children. But the emotional scars may have gone even deeper. Historians have noted how completely Margaret Beaufort devoted herself to her son. Some describe it as obsessive. Others see a survivor's love, a bond forged in pain and fear. Henry wasn't just her child. He was her legacy, her reason for enduring. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, when Henry VII planned to marry his daughter Margaret Tudor to the King of Scotland, her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, intervened. She remembered what had been done to her. She knew the risks. She and Elizabeth of York, Henry's wife, begged him to delay the marriage. A note from the king survives the queen, and my mother are very much against this marriage. They fear the King of Scots will not wait and might harm her health. Despite their protests, the marriage went ahead. Margaret Tudor, like her grandmother, was wed at 13. The cycle repeated. This is where Margaret Beaufort's story becomes more than personal tragedy. It's a reflection of a system, a world where girls were bargaining chips, where their safety was secondary to ambition. Margaret Beaufort lived through that system, and eventually she learned to wield it. She founded colleges. Christ's College and St. John's College in Cambridge still stand because of her. She managed estates, advised monarchs, and left her mark on English history. Some even called her My Lady the King's Mother, with more reverence than many queens received. But no matter how far she rose, she never escaped that cold room in Pembroke Castle. When she died on June 29, 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret Beaufort had outlived all her husbands, helped secure her son's throne, and watched her grandson inherit the crown. But her story, her real story, remains one of pain and survival. Today, some try to soften her legacy, to suggest she looked back on Edmund Tudor with fondness. After all, she asked to be buried next to him. But trauma is complicated. When a child is told something is destiny, when they're told their suffering is divine, they often believe it. They normalize it. They try to make sense of it however they can. But we know better now. We understand that what happened to Margaret Beaufort wasn't fate. It wasn't just history. It was a failure by those who should have protected her. And yet she survived. She became one of the most powerful women in England. But that power came at an unthinkable price. Whenever we speak of the Tudor legacy of Henry VII and his 6 wives, of Elizabeth Fairfax and her golden age, we must also speak of Margaret Beaufort, not just as a founder of a dynasty, but as a child who nearly lost her life to create it. She was 12 years old. He was 24. That should have been enough to stop it, but it wasn't, and that is the true cost of the Tudor crown.